Article written by a couple of my friends, actually. Helen and Drew are two really good friends of mine that I went to grad school with. Alex is a buddy as well. Jessica's a friend. And I'm going to be equally critical of their work as well, since it's old enough now for me to critique it. But currently, we have Compassion Training Alters Altruism and Neural Responses to Suffering. Why did I choose this paper? Well, one, when they're talking about compassion training, it was a meditation focused training. So I find that an interesting thing. How can a physical religious practice impact our life and impact our relationships with others? Now, I think it's really interesting here based on the last article where we had religion as one predictor, where it suggested that world religions that can make us cooperate are going to be the most successful in producing capitalism and things like that. And cooperate with each other, be nice, be compassionate towards each other, are are really at the foundational like axis of our success as animals on this planet. I mean, I'm gonna step out for a second and be like, we are animals on this planet, and look at, we are running things, right? So it's like, how did we get there? Well, some of the abilities to work together as humans have allowed us to create the most complex structures that have ever existed, that have allowed us to transcend a lot of the laws of nature, honestly. I know it's weird as we're sitting in a pandemic right now to say that, but this has been like the only failure, and well, there have been a few failures, but it's been like one of the only failures like this in my lifetime. And if you look at this, we even have a chance, well, not that we have a chance, but that what's going on out there is that we're reducing our risk, we're reducing the length it's going to exist us. We've socially developed policies that if we work together on them, like stay at home and all that, that we're gonna really be a lot better off than we would be if we didn't have these structures. You know, imagine if we didn't have science. Where would we be right now? Right? Imagine if we didn't like have knowledge structures, if we didn't have a media or a government or languages to describe what was going on. If we just keep tearing away the layers, we're like, oh wow, our culture actually protects us through a lot of this stuff, and our culture does that. Our cultures do that by focusing us a little bit on cooperation, a little bit on caring for others. So let's just sort of see how that all pans out. But ultimately, these religious practices can lead to caring for others more, which you're like, well, what's the value of that? Well, if we can trust each other on a global scale, if I can just trust somebody on the other side of the world to do an amazing job for me in my life, right, then we're going to be a much more powerful species on this planet. And I think we forget that. It's not just humans that are here. There's humans and other animals. And if you look at this from a real critical perspective, we are like 8 standard deviations above the mean on most things. Like, how did we get there? How did we create structures of science? How did we create structures of government? How did we create structures of building? How did we create all these things that impact our lives, right? Well, part of it is our cultures focus us on cooperation, compassion, caring, more so than they likely would have in the past. Now, let's begin. Compassion is a key motivator of altruistic behavior, but little is known about individuals' capacity to cultivate compassion through training. Can you train compassion? We examined whether compassion may be systematically trained by testing whether A, short-term compassion training increases altruistic behavior, and B, individual differences in altruism are associated with training-induced changes in neural responses to suffering. Pause. Full stop. Okay? Does compassion training increase altruistic behaviors, and does it do so in our brains, right? Particularly in our brain's response to the suffering of others. In healthy adults, we found that compassion training increased altruistic redistribution of funds to a victim encountered outside of the training context. So, people would give money to a victim after compassion training, and the victim was somebody who wasn't treated fairly on an economic game. Furthermore, increased altruistic behavior after compassion training was associated with altered activation in brain regions implicated in social cognition and emotional regulation, including the inferior parietal cortex and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So those are, we'll learn about that. And in DLPFC, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, connectivity with the nucleus accumbens, which is it's just like a reward center. These results suggest that compassion can be cultivated with training, and that greater altruistic behavior may emerge from increased engagement of neural systems implicated in understanding the suffering of other people, executive and emotional control, and reward processing. So we can see where this paper is going to go. There is a direct impact with they don't really sell this part too well, but there's a direct relationship with engaging in a religious-based meditation practice and changes in the brain. Engaging in a cultural practice directly changes how your brain works, functions, focuses, attends to information in the world. I didn't just choose this paper because I know a bunch of the authors on it. I chose it because it highlights how the biological foundation of thought, feeling, behavior, it can be altered with a religious-based cultural practice that can then make us more compassionate, more likely to cooperate, more likely to spread trust among each other. And if we can do that as a species, which we're not that great at, but we're better than others, but if we could do that as a species, our power would likely grow exponentially on this planet. And I'm not saying it's a good or a bad. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying it's a thing. But it's important to not ignore the fact that when you put humans next to all the other species on the planet, we do have some significant power advantages over the other species, and we also have significantly complex cultures that are way more complicated than what everything else you see out there. It's really interesting. We're exponentially greater at these things, and it's likely due to our complex brain. So let's see how that brain works. Compassion and altruism are of great interest to philosophical and scientific inquiry because of their central role in successful societies. What was I just saying? Compassion is the emotional response of caring for and wanting to help those who are suffering, and may have evolved in humans to foster altruistic acts that increase survival of kin as well as non-kin. You see where we are now. If you've been following along, this is like, oh man, this is right in with the previous paper we just read, right? Such acts include enhancing the welfare of vulnerable offspring, promoting intimate bonds between partners, and facilitating cooperation among genetically unrelated strangers. Despite the clear societal benefits of cultivating compassion, little is known about whether compassion and altruism can be trained and about the neural mechanisms that might underlie such effects. And now you're like, well, cool, compassion, where's culture at? Contemplative traditions claim that compassion can be enhanced with meditation training, and that this results in greater real-world altruistic behavior. In comparison, including in comparison, in compassion training, compassion is cultivated toward different people, including loved ones, strangers, and difficult persons, as well as the self. Studies indicate that compassion training can improve personal well-being, including stress-related immune responses, positive affect, and psychological and physical health. Compassion training also enhances responses toward other people, as one would expect, clearly, right? Expert meditation practitioners show greater empathic neural responses when listening to sounds of other people suffering during compassion meditation practice than control subjects do. Recent work suggests that compassion training can increase prosocial behavior, positive emotions towards people who are suffering, and empathic accuracy. The neural mechanisms by which compassion training alters altruism responses to suffering remain unknown. In the study reported here, we investigated whether short-term compassion training, this is like experiencing the virus for the first time, would enhance altruistic behavior toward a victim encountered outside of the training context. Altruistic behavior was assessed using the redistribution game, a novel economic decision-making task that models both unfair treatment of a victim and costly redistribution of funds to the victim. Furthermore, we measured brain activation before and after 2 weeks of training using fMRI and investigated whether increased altruism could be explained by training-induced changes in the neural response to human suffering. Where does this exist in the brain? How does it impact behavior? How are we going to look at this? How much training is there involved? 2 weeks. How are they measuring the psychology, the changes, both in behavior and neurologically in the brain? To rigorously test these hypotheses, we compared altruistic responses of participants given compassion training with responses of participants given an active control intervention of reappraisal training. So, what is reappraisal training? Let me take a break. So, for every emotion, your cognitions are required for you to actually experience it. And your cognitions actually appraise the situation, appraise the emotion, and by that it just means label it, right? So appraisal training is taking your stress or your anxiety and reappraising it to make it less negative, less harmful. So now you have like a reappraisal training has a comparison, and reappraisal is kind of focusing on your emotions. And one of the ideas is that we're selfish because some of our negative emotions get in the way of our cooperation. So reappraisal training is an interesting choice. It's not a bad one. It's not a bad one at all. It's a choice that examines a really good condition that we know that does something to a compassion training condition that we want to see if it does something. Compassion trainees cultivated compassion for different targets, and reappraisal trainees practiced reinterpreting personally stressful events to decrease negative affect. Both interventions trained emotion regulation strategies that promote well-being, but they differed in the goal of compassion. Compassion training was to increase empathic concern and the desire to relieve suffering, whereas the goal of reappraisal training was to decrease one's personal distress. Reappraisal training provided an ideal control for compassion training because all of the combination of decreased distress and increased empathic concern predicts helping behavior. Reappraisal training only decreases distress without enhancing concern. So let's put this all in perspective. You see somebody suffering, right? Part of the empathy response that we all study is that hurts you, right? That you're experiencing pain too. When you see, like, no matter what you think, when you see somebody else suffering, you then experience a little bit of suffering for yourself. You know, full stop, end of story right there. So now you have responses of dealing with that suffering in the empathy literature. You can focus on yourself and do whatever that is. That's often escaping the situation and letting the person suffer. or you can help them, right? You can help them. You can actively help them. So there's two ways to respond to your empathy or the negative affect that's associated with empathy. You can directly help somebody in need, or you can focus on yourself and get out of there, right? And so this manipulation is really focusing on those two ideas, right? Like, focus on yourself, get out of there, right? Focus on your own emotions, control them. That will likely lead you not to do anything, or do some compassion training, see if that works. We hypothesize that compassion training would increase altruistic behaviors by enhancing neural systems involved in A, the recognition and understanding of another person's suffering. So now they're giving us hypotheses about what's going on in the brain. Number one, you're going to recognize other people are suffering quicker. And B, emotional regulation of responses to suffering that support affiliation and helping behavior. So fancy way is just like, we're not going to escape. We're going to help. The neuroscience of empathy highlights two systems for understanding the states of other people. Experience sharing, which involves vicariously sharing the states of others, and mentalizing, which involves explicitly considering the understanding of others' mental states through social inferences as well as through self-referential processes. Neuroscience is saying that there's two brain areas that are likely going to be activated, or two brain systems, I should say, that are likely going to be involved here. Experience sharing, your pain is my pain, and mentalizing, which is like how, like, thinking about how somebody else feels, thinking about how you would kind of feel in that situation, but that might be vicarious. We'll have to see how they made it happen. If the neural representation of suffering is increased by compassion training, if the neural representation of suffering, so boom, my neural experience of your experience is increased by compassion training, then regulatory systems are needed to respond to the suffering with an approach rather than an avoidance response. What they're saying right there is if the brain responds to increased suffering oneself, then we're going to have to override the desire for many folks to flee when they're experiencing pain. I mean, in fact, that's what pain is. Pain tells you to leave a situation or not engage in an act anymore, right? So in order to lead to helping, there has to be a regulatory system in the brain, right? Like, that causes us to help despite the harm to ourselves. And I want you to see this. You go back. I really wish we could just go back in time and see what early humans were like without culture, right? But the idea here is that without culture, we experience somebody suffering, we're going to move away from them. I don't know if that's true. It's these assumptions that often kind of, I struggle with a lot, because I'm like, we don't know what it was like back in the day. But part of the assumption in this paper is that humans have a natural tendency to want to avoid pain, which I think is a fair. These are my friends, so I'm going to be a little bit more lenient on them, but I think this is a fair statement. However, I also think what's our biggest evolutionary advantage? It's working in groups, and so there might be, maybe this evolved before we did, and we're just the most recent beneficiaries of developing these complicated community-wide emotional responses that hold us together and allow us to do whatever we want and have the power that we want on this planet. Now, what we use with that isn't so great, as some folks are probably thinking right now, but still, like, if you look at it in terms of power, in terms of, like, view us as another species, view this as the mind of a species class, and you're like, oh my lord, right? It's quite a eye-opening thing to see how much we use symbols and how much we use each other to survive, right? Symbols, structures, systems, they have their negative consequences. They have their power consequence in survival. And I don't want you to forget that while you go out into the real world and just think things like, oh, democracy just evolved over time. Like, no, it's about power, It's like these cooperative mechanisms, which seem very nice and friendly, put us together and maybe have us work together at the detriment of who else? And these are questions we got to think of when we're thinking about a paper about compassion and altruism from a cultural psychologist perspective. If we enter that like biologist perspective, then we get a sense like, hey, wait, the human species is quite interesting in our kin focus. Even though we feel like we're selfish, if you look at this, part of that selfishness, part of that power is coming from our group cohesiveness. Prior theoretical and empirical work suggests that altruistic responses toward another person's suffering can be strengthened through either of two regulatory pathways. A, decreasing personal distress, which reduces negative arousal and avoidance behavior, got that. So what can we do? Decrease your personal distress to somebody else's suffering. That'll make you more likely to act. This is a lesson for everyone in this class. When you're in an emergency and if you feel overwhelmed, take some breaths, calm it down, right? What you're gonna do is avoid everything, and you need to approach things. And B, increasing empathic concern, which strengthens the motivation to approach and relieve another person's suffering. So empathic concern is having concern over somebody else's condition, right? Like it's not simply understanding, oh, they're in a bad state, sucks for them. It's like, okay, they are experiencing this negative life thing. Their daily life is very much affected. I have this empathic concern, right, where it's not about necessarily me experiencing their emotion. It's about me understanding the negative impacts of their life, right? And that understanding leads me to feel concern, and that concern leads me to want to help. Which strengthens... In response to suffering, we predict that greater altruism in compassion trainees would be associated with increased activation in prefrontal cortex, given its role in controlled processes, emotional regulation, and frontoparietal control networks. So, in response to suffering, they think these higher order brain areas that are associated with specific concept, like we call the self, executive function, the self, right? Like these areas of the brain that are able to downregulate emotional areas, right? And if you look, they're saying in the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, this is the part of the brain that Phineas Gage blew up. This is the part of the brain that makes you who you are. That's your personality. That's yourself. Well, let's dive into that a little bit. It's the decisions you make. It's the morals you carry. Biologically, it's the ability of that brain area to downregulate emotional brain areas. Things like that. Okay, so they're making a specific argument about a specific brain area. We also predicted that compassion training would be associated with decreased amygdala activation. Amygdala is the emotional center of the brain. Oh, lost my spot. Given the amygdala's role in responding to negative stimuli and distress. Further, we hypothesized that greater prosocial behavior after compassion training would be associated with higher levels of activation in the anterior insula, a pain center, which has been implicated in studies of empathy and compassion. It sure has. It's sort of like the first person experience of somebody else's third person pain, and predicts helping behavior. This general prosocial behavior would also be correlated with increased activation in the nucleus accumbens, which has been linked to charitable giving and positive appraisals of aversive stimuli. So the nucleus accumbens has been associated, this brain area is associated with who gives to charities, and you know, having that positive appraisal of an aversive stimuli, like, you know, viewing that pit bull in the street and having that love for that little guy, right? That little puppy, right? Even though he's kind of scary and he barks loud, right? Things like that is what they're talking about, except with humans. We specifically tested these hypotheses against the reappraisal group, in which the psychological goal was self-focused to decrease one's own suffering rather than other focus to decrease other people's suffering through compassion. Although many of the same regions are implicated in reappraisal as in compassion, we expected that the hypothesized changes would not be associated with altruistic behavior because the behavior is not congruent with reappraisal's goal. So they're using this as a control. They're saying there's a lot. They didn't really go into it too much, but they're saying there's some brain areas that are associated with both behaviors across these two different conditions, but not the helping. They don't hypothesize it's going to be involved in the helping. And so they're going to use these controls, right? This specific control, this appraisal of one's stress control, because it's associated with so many similar areas and only a few that are different. So it really is a good control. And I know Drew and Helen really well. And the way neuroscientists think about experimental design is a little bit different than the way I do. When I think about experimental design as a social cultural psychologist, I'm like, where have I seen this in the world? When they think about it in terms of explanation of things that they've seen in the world. And if there's not a neurological explanation, they don't believe it exists. I've actually had this conversation with Drew a few times, and I think that's really interesting, because then you look for controls not based on how similar they are to your experimental paradigm, even though this one is similar. You look for controls that are similar in the brain response in the literature, right? So like you're looking for a control behavior that has one thing different from the experimental group. You're looking for a behavior that we know from a neurological perspective, that we want a neurological pattern that's almost identical with one change in neurological activity across the conditions. So that's what they're searching for. They're searching for two sort of social interventions, the meditation-based compassion training, which they didn't focus on it as a cultural aspect, but I am for this class, right? And that self-focused reappraisal training. Those two trainings have very similar neurological responses in the literature, but they differ on the things that these folks just talked about. So I think that's a lesson in experimental design and why it differs between sort of biological psychologists or neuroscientists, as we call them today, and other types of psychologists that work not in the neurological realm, is that, we're looking for parity in experience in social psychology, and in biological psychology, they're looking for parity in neurological response, except for the one thing being different. By parity, I mean similarity. Okay? So I think that's really cool. So we heard the intro. What we didn't hear was how meditation, where this compassion training is derived from, is a cultural invention, is, this very big cultural practice all over the world, but originating in Asian countries, and Asian folks as well. But it's this cultural practice that bonds people together, that allows people to transcend their emotional reactions. It's really healthy, actually. It's a really healthy practice to engage in. But from a cultural perspective, I think it's important to look at this practice as if, right, it's a tool that causes us to engage and facilitate the cultural goals that exist outside of us. So let's see how they examine this, and then we'll talk more in a little bit. 56 participants completed the entire protocol, and the final sample consisted of 41 participants who believed they were interacting with real players in the redistribution game. So that's saying they lost about 14 participants who expressed, the other 14 participants expressed suspicion about the manipulation and were therefore excluded from the analysis. See these tables and you can look stuff up online. Now, I actually do have a, you know, I don't know. I kind of have a problem with that. That seems a little weird to me. They engaged in the activity, but there was suspicion that it was real. I don't know. It just, when you see something like this, that's a large percentage too. It's like 15 of, it's like 20 of 60, right? It's almost like a third. It's a little bit less than a third. So like a fourth, right? A fourth of the participants didn't buy your setup. I don't know. I don't think that's a good sign. The good sign is that they reported it. Ultimately, too, what I want to point out is that sample sizes, the required sample size for studies has gone up quite a bit in the last 10, 15 years. And, you know, I don't think a paper with this sample size would be published in Psych Science anymore, just because we understand now in psychology that who knows if these results would replicate or not with such a small sample size. So each participant was randomly assigned to receive either compassion training or reappraisal training, completed 2 weeks of training, 11 out of 14 practice days were required, and attended an fMRI session both before the start of the training and after training finished. The groups did not differ in age, gender, baseline, trait compassion, or the amount of practice time they received. Participants were healthy adults, right-handed, and had no previous experience in meditation or cognitive behavioral therapy. So boom, they had no experience in this cultural tool. What's 2 weeks do to a person? How's it change them? In the ways that the previous article, the Henrik one, are talking about, making people more cohesive. When you make people more cohesive, you make us more powerful. When you make us more powerful, we as a group have to choose how to use that power, and frankly, we haven't been doing a good job of that recently. Okay. No participants had issues that would pose a risk for his or her safety in the scanner. No welders, no metal in the eye, that sort of thing. The experiment was approved by the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Health Sciences IRB, the board that makes sure everything is ethical. All subjects gave informed consent and were paid for participation. Procedure. Overview. Participants came to the laboratory on 3 occasions. At visit 1, each participant was randomly assigned to compassion training or reappraisal training and briefly instructed to the assigned strategy, following which he or she or they practiced the fMRI task in a mock MRI scanner. Visit 2 occurred approximately 1 week later. During this visit, participants completed the pre-training fMRI scan and began training later that day. Visit 3 occurred immediately after the 2 weeks of training were completed. This visit included the post-training fMRI scan and the altruistic behavior task performed outside of the scanner. For more details, look in the supplemental materials. So this was a very involved study. There were 3 visits. The first visit, they did take an fMRI, but it was just kind of baseline, trying to figure out what's going on here, introduce people to the manipulation, that sort of thing. Visit 2, 1 week later, and realize there's trainings happening throughout this period, so 1 week of training later, participants completed the scan, and then after 2 weeks, let's engage in some compassion behavior and see what's happening. Trainings. Training consisted of practicing either compassion or reappraisal using guided audio instructions for 30 minutes per day for 2 weeks. Audio trainings. Compassion trainees practice cultivating feelings of compassion for different targets: a loved one, the stranger, the self, and a difficult person. And reappraisal trainees practice reinterpreting personally stressful events to decrease negative affect. So both groups are kind of working on controlling their negative affect. One's working on, controlling their negative affect by making it positive towards others, and the others worked on not experiencing that negative affect by reappraising it. So we get that idea. Altruistic behavior task redistribution game. We tested whether compassion training could affect altruistic behavior outside of the training context using the redistribution game. The economic decision-making task models both unfair treatment of a victim and costly redistribution of funds to the victim.
Using anonymous online interactions, participants first observed a dictator endowed with $10 transfer an unfair amount of money, $1, to a victim who had no money. After witnessing this violation of the fairness norm, participants could choose to spend any amount of their own endowment, $5, to compel the dictator to give twice that amount to the victim. Participants were paid the amount that was left in their endowment after making the decision. So essentially, you could spend $5 to get the victim $10 and get the victim paid by the perpetrator by $10. I love economic games. I do. But it's this kind of task that the previous article is like, hey, this is not a universal task. This is how people engage with money. So we're going to, based on what we read in Henrik's work, we're just going to kind of like take a step back and say, okay, we understand that this situation may only be about participation in the economic system. So we need to take the previous knowledge that we have and learn how to interpret the future knowledge that we're going to gain in a more scientifically correct manner. So, with that being said, we don't know if these results actually examine compassion or just sort of economic compassion, the compassion we see in the economic system. But my counter argument is that isn't this the most widespread system in all of humanity? We disagree. You might be like, hey, wait, there's some communist countries. Yes, there are. But even the communist countries like China, right, engage in exchange of goods and services for monetary funds at both the national and interpersonal level. There are classes in China. There is a super wealthy group of people in China as well. And I think when you look at this, what's going on right now, we're in a pandemic, but we still have to trade pieces of paper for food because that's the strongest system in our society. If you look at this right now, what's going on is people are literally like, well, we could die, but the economy's going to suffer, so I should go to work. That is kind of intense. Also, our experience here, we're still going through it. We're still pushing through the everyday activities as if everything's still normal a little bit, because this is the activity that's going to position you in capitalism for a successful life. So I'm actually okay with the economic measures. I use them myself, but I'm okay with them because if you look at our lives, a lot of our lives are dictated by economics. What we can eat, where we can go for vacation, how much leisure we can do, how much educational preparedness our children get, right? All that stuff is predicted by our finances, our economics. And so I'm actually disagreeing with Heinrich a little bit, but agreeing with him as well. I'm just saying a majority of humans on this planet engage in these processes, and understanding how people emotionally engage in capitalism is probably one of the most important foundational questions for somebody who wants to end capitalism, honestly, right? Like, if that was your goal, or even maintain it. Why do humans choose this over other sort of methods of distribution of time and resources? Sorry for the tangent, but I like those. Let's go back. Participants were told that they were playing the game with live players over the internet. Effects of demand characteristics on behavior were minimized by presenting the game as a unique study, describing it in purely economic terms, never instructing participants to use the training they received, removing the physical presence of players and experimenters during gameplay. And why would they do that? Why would you want to have an empathy training or an empathy experiment where you don't interact with others? Because that adds noise to your data, right? When you're interacting with real others, there's real different people, there's real different personalities, there's real different like prejudices that are going to come out. So if you're not even allowed to talk to somebody and you're only allowed to engage with somebody over the internet in a like anonymous exchange,
then you're reducing the possibility of all these confounders impacting your study. So I actually think that was a really good move. Because compassionate behavior is specifically invoked by unfairness, all participants observed the same pre-programmed unfair dictator offer. At the end of the entire protocol, participants were debriefed and asked whether they believed they were playing against real people in the game. Data were analyzed only for participants who believed the paradigm. I mean, I get that. I get that, right? It's so, you know, I see why they reduced people, why they got rid of it. It's just sort of like, for me, how can we reduce that attrition rate? Like, we're doing this science on random assignment to conditions, right? But all of a sudden now we got like attrition in our data. We got quite a bit. And it's just like, is it randomly assigned anymore? Is this an artifact of lack of random assignment? These are questions that come up when decisions like this are made. It's kind of like, for me, with just the 50-some participants, I want to see, you know, 100, 150 per condition, not 25 per condition. I want to see at least 50 per condition. And that's a recent change, but it makes it harder for me to look back at the field's work and trust everything in it. Now let's go to the fMRI task. If you didn't know what this was, I apologize. fMRI is functional magnetic resonance imaging, and this is, I've had a couple in my life, and this is where they look in your brain to see where the blood is flowing, you know, and essentially that's how it works. And we assume that based on where the blood is flowing, versus a control or baseline condition, that those are the areas that are activated and helping to make the decisions that you are making. Now, I want to point out that this isn't a foolproof process. It's important to note that there are a lot of assumptions here. They're measuring blood flow. They're not measuring electrical firing of the synapses, which would be better, right? Like, but with the blood flow, you're able to examine where the blood is circulating, and there's an assumption that this blood is leading to neurological processes, and I think that assumption's pretty well founded. However, you could imagine a tool that'd be able to pick up on the patterns of neurons firing. I want you to imagine 150 years from now, when we're able to do this, we're going to be able to decode individual neurons through a scan, like an fMRI scan. How does an fMRI scan work? Well, there's like a magnetic field around you, and if you've ever been in one, it goes click, ka-chunk, ka-chunk, but it does it like 12 times a second. So it's like ka-chunk, 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 ka-chunk. So what that's doing is there's a magnet that's consistently rotating. And I think that sound, it's either the picture being taken of the brain or it's the magnet. So you got this consistent rotation back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Well, the blood has some very strong iron components to it. I believe it's the iron components. It's definitely unbalanced like water is, where there's a positive pole and there's a negative pole, so things can hold together. Same thing cohesion happens in our blood through electronic means, essentially. But what actually happens is that positive side of the hemoglobin molecule, which is what I believe they're measuring. You got to understand, I'm way out of my element here, but this is based on my understanding of fMRI research. When that magnet moves back and forth, you can track where the blood is going. You can literally see where it was in the previous second, see where it is now. You can see where blood is at any given moment in time, you know, but essentially what's going on is you're seeing the poles. You're seeing this by rotational angles. That magnet moves, the blood molecules move with it, so you can see where they are and where they're flowing, or where there's more of them, essentially. So, I mean, I think it's really cool. fMRI is a combination of biology, physics, psychology, you know, so biochemistry, all these interesting fields to come up with a tool that we now use to measure compassion. To determine whether altruistic behavior was predicted by changes in neural responses to human suffering, we scanned participants using fMRI before and after training while they employed their assigned emotion regulation strategy. Participants in the two groups were presented with images of human suffering and non-suffering. So there's a neutral condition. So participants were either exposed to, probably at the same time, but exposed to human suffering and human non-suffering. Compassion trainees were instructed to invoke feelings of compassion while silently repeating compassion-generating phrases. In contrast, reappraisal trainees were instructed to decrease negative emotions by silently reinterpreting the emotional meaning of the images. If you want to learn more about this, check out the supplemental materials. All you have to do is go into our library, go into Psych Science's website, and find these supplemental materials. They are free to download. You can read about exactly how this went down. We tested whether compassion training could affect altruistic behavior outside of the training context using the redistribution game. This economic decision-making task models both unfair treatment of a victim and costly redistribution of funds to the victim. Using anonymous online interactions, participant... Oh, I already talked about that. Okay. So, the fMRI task and stimuli. To determine whether altruistic behavior was predicted by changes in neural responses to human suffering, we scanned participants using fMRI before and after training while they employed their assigned emotion regulation strategy. Participants in the two groups were presented with images of human suffering and non-suffering. Compassion trainees were instructed to invoke feelings of compassion while silently repeating compassion-generating phrases. In contrast, reappraisal trainees were instructed to decrease negative emotions by silently reinterpreting the emotional meaning of the images. See supplementary materials. Now, this definitely has the work of my friend Drew all over it, who makes a lot of pretty graphs. Makes the prettiest graphs I've seen in science. And this is the paradigm of and results for the redistribution game. In the first stage of the redistribution game, you can see that a dictator, 10 minus 1 gives the victim $1, the participant has 5. And it's an algebra problem, so the participant can decide to punish the dictator by a lot of money. Essentially, the fair response would be $5 given by the dictator to the victim. They gave 4, so you could do the math. That leads you to get 4. That's 2. So $2 would solve the economic disparity. For me, a question that I have is, did people give more than $2, right? Like, not give, but punish with more than $2 to hurt people more than the fairness math, the equality math, right? Like, how much do we punish rule violators? Do we punish them too just to make everything fair? But it's not fair for us. Are we willing to lose our money to ensure that the society is fair, right? That's the question that's being examined. And since we're here, we're at the graph, we can see that compassion training clearly increased this altruistic punishment, so this redistribution and rank. I guess they did a rank test. Well, we'll have to read in their methods, but right now we can see this is what they were engaging in. They did the meditation for a few weeks. This is their main measure. How do people respond in these situations in a completely unrelated experiment? And also, how do people's brain responses predict how do they respond in these experiments? Images of suffering depicted emotional distress, physical pain, or acts of violence. Neutral images depicted... Let me make sure here. Okay. So these are things they saw. Images of suffering depicted emotional distress, physical pain, or acts of violence. Neutral images depicted people in non-emotional situations, such as working or walking down a street. 2 parallel sets of images were created. They don't seem too parallel, 20 suffering and 16 neutral, to ensure that participants viewed different images before and after training. Set order was counterbalanced and randomized. Images were pseudo-randomized so that 3 or more images from either condition were not presented in a row.
Image randomization was performed once for each set, and then fixed images. Images were balanced across sets for published normative ratings of valence and arousal, as well as for purposes of hue, luminance, and saturation. Look at all the confounding variables they looked into here, with the most extreme being hue, luminance, and saturation. These are all color properties of the image themselves. They did all this counterbalancing, which I kind of skipped over because we're not in a research methods class, but you could see like how many things they precisely altered, how many things they precisely attended to. Participants were instructed to regulate their emotional responses to the images over 3 blocks. So here's the fMRI task. Each block began with a 20-second fixation baseline period. Participants then received both an auditory and visual instruction stating that they should invoke either compassion or reappraisal depending on their group assignment, which was followed by a fixation cross for about 5 to 7 seconds. They then applied the assigned regulation strategy to a series of 12 images. Each image was presented for 12 seconds and separated by a fixation interval. The images were already described. Blocks ended with a final fixation baseline for about 40 seconds. After each block, participants saw each image again for 2 seconds and rated the arousal of each image. So there's a few different measures going on here. First, let's just kind of begin. They have these fixation periods, which are supposed to be periods of no compassion. You're measuring the brain activity when nothing's going on, so that's important. So then they were given the instructions, and then they tried to regulate their emotions on these 12 images, and that's what was measured. The ability of people to use their regulation strategy, right, to regulate their emotions to these images. So people are literally being asked to engage in their 2 different strategies, the one of emotional suppression, essentially, and the one of fostering compassion towards others. And then at the end, they rated how arousing each image was, and that's just like how intense each image was. Behavioral analyses. So these are their results here. These are their results. So let's just kind of see here. Across all participants, the redistribution response was positively skewed. Don't worry about that. And 2 participants qualified as outliers. Because of these violations of normality, we rank ordered the behavioral response across both groups so that strong assumptions were not made about the scaling of normality of the residuals. That's just fancy stats talk for saying we don't think traditional stats will work on this data. Parametric tests, which is what we call stats that aren't p-value. Well, they're not really p-value based. You'll get a p-value for them, but they're not really p-value based. But they're really not assumption based, so they don't make all these assumptions of normality in the data. Parametric tests were then performed on the ranked data. To test the mean difference between groups, we performed independent samples t-tests on the ranks. They did this stat. For in-depth analysis and discussion, go see the supplementals. fMRI analyses overview. A series of tests were conducted to identify regions in which changes due to training, the differences across the 2 different conditions, predicted greater redistribution in compassion training than in reappraisal training. So let's break that down. A series of tests were conducted to identify regions in which changes of my Siri came somehow. In which changes due to training predicted greater redistribution in compassion training than in reappraisal training. So what's going on? Something just doesn't. I'm just gonna cue you in. Like something doesn't feel perfectly right about this to me, and it's particularly looking at regions in which changes due to training predicted greater distribution in compassion training than in reappraisal training. And I'm just kind of confused to make sure that they're not cherry picking brain areas that are associated with differences in these behaviors, or only picking people who behaved in a certain way that supports the hypothesis. So I'm kind of like, I don't know what's going on here, but I do know fMRI researchers do some things that I consider like not great statistically with their data. And so we'll just keep reading on. A whole brain interaction contrast grouped by redistribution task was tested on neural change scores. Follow-up tests were conducted using both across and within subjects analysis to identify regions that were functionally connected to clusters identified in the interaction analysis and networks involved in emotional regulation. Finally, we investigated whether reported arousal was associated with either redistribution or neural changes. Supplementary materials exist, and maybe I'll have to go there. But to identify regions that were functionally connected to clusters identified in the interaction analysis and networks involved in emotional regulation. So the group, a whole brain contrast was tested on neural change scores. Follow-up tests were conducted using both across and within subjects analysis to identify regions that were functionally connected to clusters identified in the interaction analysis and networks involved in emotional regulation. So they looked at brain areas that showed a group by redistribution interaction, essentially. So the brain areas that show, and this isn't necessarily how I would do it. I would throw brain areas as the dependent variable. But what they did was they looked and they found brain areas that showed the pattern they were looking for. And then, I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily the best statistical analysis. So if you're choosing brain areas that is showing the pattern you're looking for, this interaction, that's a little different than saying, does this brain area show this pattern, right? Like, it's actually the reverse of it. So they're looking at the whole brain. You got to understand that there's so much data in the whole brain when you do an fMRI that it's kind of insane. But they're looking at this data and they're saying, what areas show the pattern I predict? Honestly, it's basically the same thing that I would do. It just seems reversed, right? Like, so they just all they did was identify which brain areas showed the pattern they were predicting. So instead of just leaving the pattern open to prediction, they had a preset pattern neurologically, and they found it, and they wanted to see, and it makes sense experimentally now I'm thinking about it, but they wanted to see, like, okay, what brain areas show this group by redistribution rank interaction. I don't think I'd word the paper this way, but different fields have different styles. It just took me a moment to break this down. This is basically the same analysis that I would do. The wording of it's just kind of described a little weird and uniquely. Let's read about the interaction analysis. Individual functional and structural MRI brain data were pre-processed and normalized to the MNI space. That is just a brain space that identifies areas of the brain on average in people. So what you have to understand is that everybody has a slightly different brain, and all we can do is, instead of like looking at each person's brain and identifying it as a specific area, what you do is you average everybody's brain together, and you use coordinates to say the average of all these images. This area is the amygdala, this area is the prefrontal cortex, things like that. Each participant's neural response to suffering during regulation was estimated with the contrast between activation to images of suffering and activation to neutral images at each fMRI scan time point. So they are looking for areas that changed across the two image sets. And beta coefficient, don't worry, now we're in the area that it doesn't matter for you. We're converted to percentage signal change. The training-induced changes were calculated by these, I'm going to skip that, voxel. We're not going to really, if I start getting into this, we're going to be here all day. First whole brain analyses were conducted and corrected for multiple comparisons. This analysis indicated the right inferior parietal cortex this analysis identified the right inferior parietal cortex. So they're saying this analysis indicated this specific brain area. To decompose the interactions, we extracted these change scores from clusters for each participant and analyzed them to yield parameter estimates and determine the directionality of the relationship for each group. They just process the data. This is a question right now. We can just have it existing for us not understanding exactly what's going on. That's okay. These values were used for descriptive and diagnostic purposes only. Fine. In region of interest analyses, data from the group by distribution rank interaction were corrected for multiple comparisons. Okay, this is just stats jargony stuff. So with the correlation with the interaction analysis, they found like this one brain area that responds in the way they expected, and I assume there's going to be other analyses. Conjunction analyses to identify regions that may be functionally connected to the IPC. All right, now I'm getting it. So they found the area that was associated with the behavior. Now they want to find everything that comes before it because they have all this time sequence data. In order to increase the amount participants redistributed in each training group, we performed a conjunction analysis. Requiring voxels to be and be identified with the original. This analysis identified a cluster in the dorsolateral PFC. I'll actually read it. I'll read it slowly. To identify regions that may be functionally connected to the IPC, the area that shows the interaction pattern. There was only one area that showed the interaction pattern they were predicting. And that's what's predicting behavior. In order to increase the amount, we got that. We performed this analysis looking at voxels or brain cubes. So a voxel is just like a brain cube. The stronger your magnet in your MRI, the more brain cubes you have. To be correlated with changes in IPC activation across participants in both groups. So they're looking for brain areas that were correlated with changes in participants in both groups' behavior. So it had to hold that requirement. The brain area that they're looking for will impact people in both groups. And B, identified the original, and it will also show the interaction pattern they're predicting. This analysis identified a cluster in one brain area, the one they predicted, the DLPFC, which is part of the brain area that was blown up by Phineas Gage. And so now they're telling us what brain areas are involved with the compassion behavior. Now, I'm not going to lie. It took me a bit to figure that out, and you got to see me struggle with that. I hope it wasn't too annoying, but what you can see at the end here is that they're actually doing a pretty cool analysis. They're finding brain areas that show the pattern of behavior that they're interested in, because they believe firmly that brain drives behavior, and psychology as a field generally agrees with them. So this is a pretty dope way to view the stats. So boom, what brain area is associated with this behavior, right? And then they looked at brain areas and they said, okay, what brain areas vary based on our experimental manipulations and the behavior that we're interested in? What areas can predict change? What other areas can predict changes in the IPC, right? And they found that the DLPFC was causing changes in the IPC. So the way to view this is that the IPC, which is, they just told us what it was. I just had it. This is not. I'm gonna have to cut this, so I will be cutting this out. So not gonna worry about it. Oh yeah, inferior parietal cortex. The IPC, the inferior parietal cortex, right, was the area driving the behavior that they were interested in, the differences in compassion. This was caused by activation in the DLPFC, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So we're understanding the patterns that lead to redistribution in that game. It's in the IPC, and we're understanding the brain areas that are regulating that area, that are causing that behavior, the DLPFC. So you got the DLPFC is an area that is basically associated with self. In terms of the stuff we've been talking about in this class, this is the area that's associated with individualistic and collectivistic sense of self in some studies, not all. The other area I'm less familiar with, but I've seen it described in discussions of pain. I might be wrong, but ultimately that's what I believe it shows. To determine regions in which altered PFC connectivity predicted higher amounts of redistribution in compassion trainings than reappraisal trainings, we perform. So now what they're saying is like they're looking for, okay, they got people in compassion training and people in reappraisal training. They know the DLPFC is the foundation of this behavior. They know is the like cause of the final behavior. They know that the IPC is what's driving the behavior in the way they predicted at the group level. Now they're trying to find other brain areas that exist between the DLPFC and the IPC that predict changes in the IPC. It's not like the DLPFC just magically changes. It's not like the self magically changes pain. There's effort, activity, and change that happens in between. The PPI regressor, don't worry about it, consisted of comparing DLPFC connectivity in response to images of suffering with DLPFC connectivity in response to neutral imaging. Training-induced PPI changes, you can see where this is going, right? They looked at this difference between neutral and emotionally relevant stimuli, right? They predicted a training effect, right, across those who had the compassion training and those who didn't. What other brain areas came in between to predict actual behavior in compassion trainees than in reappraisal trainees? They performed this analysis, voxel-wise regression maps, multiple comparisons, blah, 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 blah. For descriptive purposes, mean were extracted from the clusters for each participant and yield. So this is all just stat stuff. They didn't tell us. Oh, they just told us how they were going to do the analysis. Okay. Correlational analysis. Compassion training may increase altruistic behavior by decreasing personal distress evoked by suffering. To test this, we computed arousal change scores and correlated them with altruistic redistribution in each group to examine whether changes in arousal were associated with changes in neural responses to suffering. We compute, so the prediction here is that if you're too aroused, if you're experiencing too much negative emotion, you're not going to help. With changes in suffering, we computed correlations between arousal change scores and neural change scores identified in the previous fMRI analyses in each group. And so essentially what we just got into here was a very poor description of how they used the fMRI machine. I mean poor description like on my part, not on their part. A poor interpretation. And so ultimately we're trying to figure out here like what is driving this behavior. And if I read this correctly, their pretest showed that DLPFC and the IPC are the targets, right? They then set up all these extra examinations that are going to allow us to see like what was going on differently in the compassion group versus what's going on differently in the appraisal group. And now we're going to get to the results. So that was a lot. And I'm going to skip some stuff here just because this isn't a stats class and I get it. I'll do my best, but if it gets a little... I should have probably skipped the previous section, but if we get into the weeds again, I'll make sure to push this forward. And you can always see, look at the flow of when I read these papers. The intro is always the easiest to read. The methods and results. I struggle, I stumble, I take my time with them. I Google things. Findings in an independent validation sample confirm that altruistic redistribution is a behavioral signature of compassion. Individuals who endorse greater levels of trait empathic concern redistributed more money. In the main study, so that's just saying like compassionate people redistribute more money. No one's ever done that. They ran a study within a study that they used just to write one sentence. That's the level of intensity of scientists. In the main study, after 2 weeks of training, compassion training spent more money to redistribute funds to the victim compared with reappraisal training. Independent samples T. So we got that. That was that box we saw earlier. Compassion trainees also spent more than individuals with no training in the validation sample. So they did this validation sample and they found that their compassion trainees did more than the average person in the sample. So we know based on this group-wise average that the compassion training increased redistribution, not only compared to the appraisal training, but compared to a do-nothing control. Compassion trainees spent nearly 2 times more money than reappraisal trainees. 1.14, which would get versus 0.62 respectively. Now let's put this in context. I spend 1.15 or 1.14. The participant's going to get 230. Is it fair? No. But is it fair for that person to lose all their money? No. Most on average in the compassion, people are willing to give up $1.14. In the non-compassion, they're willing to give up 62 cents to make sure that somebody else is treated semi-fairly or somebody else is punished for treating somebody else unfairly is probably the better way to consider it. But ultimately, is that a huge increase? I don't know. They were given $5. It's a large percentage increase. Is it a large practical increase? I think I don't know. I think that's a question that's up in the air. And increased the distribution between dictator and the victim by 57%. So they overall increased the money that the dictator gave by 60%. So if they didn't do this, people would have been paid 40% less. In contrast, reappraisal trainees increased the distribution by only 31%. Why is that important? They're not a pure control, right? They are an emotional regulation control. And what they're doing here is they're looking at how much wealth their behavior redistributed. And you can see that it's 57% versus 31%, right? If these groups didn't exist, a lot less money would have been spent. But basically the dictators were kind of jerky is what you're getting a sense for. But also I made an assumption here that isn't actually true. So I made an assumption that the dictators were giving, oh, no, they saw the dictator give no money. Okay, yeah, no, so that is true. So they didn't really correct the situation totally, right? They gave them a little bit more money. They kept some for themselves. They kept about $4 for themselves. So they were willing to give up $1. They weren't willing to give up $2 of their own money and for somebody else to make a little bit more than them. So relatively, they were always looking out for number one. I think that's interesting. This demonstrates that purely mental training and compassion can result in observable altruistic changes toward a victim, even when individuals are not explicitly cued to generate compassion. Remember, they weren't asked to be compassionate here. Neuroimaging. You know this is going to be a hard section. We hypothesize that greater altruism resulting from compassion training would be predicted by training-related changes in the neural responses to images of suffering. The whole brain group training, reappraisal versus compassion by redistribution rank interaction test revealed that training-induced changes in right IPC activation were differentially associated with altruistic redistribution in the two training groups. The IPFC is the most proximal predictor of the behavior. In compassion trainees, greater IPC activation due to training was associated with greater redistribution, but this was not found in reappraisal training. So now their analyses are making a little bit more sense. So in compassion training, those who where compassion training led to more IPC activation, you saw more redistribution. You did not see that in folks in the reappraisal training.
with the a priori before region of interest, the amygdala and things like that they mentioned earlier, their predictions didn't work out. So none of their hypotheses that they had when they started this study were actually held true. Let's see what was held true. The IPC is implicated in experience sharing as part of the mirror neuron network, so pain. And we investigated whether the IPC was functionally connected to other regions that also differentially predicted redistribution between groups. So the IPC predicts the redistribution between groups and appears to be the most proximal, the strongest predictor of that. So they're going to call this the integrator. They're saying like the IPC is driving the behavior. But now they're going to look at other brain areas to see what's driving IPC activity. The IPC conjunction test identified only the DLPFC. Of all the brain areas that were associated with redistribution to a significant level, only the area associated with self, the area associated with regulation, this higher order brain area was driving the changes in the IPC. So what you're getting is that actively one's conscious understanding of the world was able to regulate a biological process that happens without conscious awareness. So I think that's really cool. Where greater increases in DLPFC activation predicted greater altruistic redistribution in compassion trainings, and the opposite relationship was found in reappraisal trainings. Okay, so both folks engaged in DLPFC, but only in those who were training to be more compassionate did DLPFC impact the IPC and lead to behavior, right? Those folks, this is actually really cool about this design. Those folks in the reappraisal training showed similar DLPFC changes, right, as a response to the training, to the pictures, but this did not translate to redistribution of wealth. So what do we learn here when somebody suffered? When they have, if they suffered and the DLPFC reduces the IPC, then you will get redistribution behavior. If your DLPFC, which is your area of self-focus, of executive function, of self, of all these higher order processes, when that area is working but not working on compassion, it doesn't impact the IPC and it doesn't impact the behavior at the end. That's what we're seeing here. The changes in IPC and DLPFC were highly coupled with compassion training, reappraisal training, and both regions differentially predicted redistribution between groups. This is what I just said. These findings suggest that frontoparietal executive control networks, the self, may be recruited by compassion training in order to reduce emotions and increase altruistic behavior. Not only was it impacting one's emotions, it was altering the behavior. One of the reasons that they probably didn't notice changes in the amygdala is that I think both, which was their main prediction, I know both of these researchers, that's Drew's main area, both of these interventions focus people on calming their emotional response down. So it's not necessarily calming the emotional response down or the activation of the amygdala that matters. It's doing so with a conscious effort to think about others' feelings, to understand that others experience crappy situations, to really feel for other people. And like it's that extra bit, focusing on my own emotions versus focusing on the emotions of others that's driving this response, right? So when you're focusing on the emotions of others, you're using your DLPFC just like when you're focusing on your own emotions. But the consequence of that executive controls network are different because the goals are different. This is where goals and the brain interact. This area, like when you're, I actually take comfort in this area. This area gives me some comfort that I'm going to always feel like a stable entity. And when I feel like a stable individual, a stable entity, I'm not aware of all the disconnected neurological and psychological processes that are happening that are causing me to do weird behaviors. I view myself as a consistent entity, but also this is the area that I'm probably calling myself, right? And this area controls other areas of the brain. We just don't know how. Here we see they're correlated, but we don't know why. We don't know the mechanism of how one brain area, the PFC,
downregulates another brain area like the amygdala, which then differentially, we don't know how it differentially impacts the IPC, which then directly predicts behavior. We only know the bookends here, right? We know that there's regulation control processes happening, and those differ across we know that regulation DLPFC activity is happening, and in the compassion training, this is what's directly reducing the IPC, but we don't know how that happens. We don't know how one area of the brain controls the other. So for my neuroscientist interested students, this stuff is really cool. The neuroscience of cultural psychology is really cool. Let's read the next area. Emotion regulation is thought to involve the influence of the PFC over other regions, such as the amygdala, insula, and the NACC. It's okay if you don't know this stuff. Using PPI, whatever, we tested whether changes in task-related functional connectivity between the DLPFC and amygdala, DLPFC and NACC, or DLPFC and insula predicted greater altruistic redistribution in compassion training than in reappraisal training. Using the DLPFC cluster, now don't worry about this, they're just using their data, right? The DLPFC cluster defined by the IPFC conjunction. So using the areas, specific voxels, brain cubes, this is where I don't agree with fMRI research. Using the brain, in the DLPFC, they defined it, right? They looked at each brain and they actually had an undergrad basically circle it very intensely with computer programs. And they examined the relationship between only specific voxels in brain cubes in that area that showed a correlation with the IPC. I have a problem with this. I understand why the neuroscientists don't, but I have a problem with this. You're saying one brain area is a brain area, right? You identify that brain area, and then you only include the brain cubes that show the correlation with the outcome you're interested in. This would never fly in social psych. We would not be allowed to get away with that. For me, the way I think about stats, it's like you define a brain area, you got to take the signal and the noise, right? You can't just pull what you think the signal is and say everything else is noise. We don't know that what they're claiming to be signal, the brain voxels that are correlated with behavior, are actually real signals, right? We don't know what they represent. What if it was every other voxel in the brain or in the amygdala? What does that mean? I have no idea. And so this is my critique statistically of fMRI research's methods. They choose only brain cubes that are correlated with the events they're interested in. And it seems weird to me when you have a very specific hypothesis. And so what's going on here is folks are reducing the error in their studies and making smaller p-values. So I don't know what that means overall for the field of fMRI research. I think it means that, I don't know, I'm a little uncomfortable with this specific statistical method, but it's used in all the fMRI research, but it's been critiqued by others as well. So I'm off that. I'm sorry about that. We found a significant, now going back to it, we found a significant interaction in the NACC demonstrating that DLPFC to NACC connectivity was differentially associated with redistribution in compassion training compared with reappraisal training. So now, like, we thought they're saying that the most proximal predictor was the IPC stated earlier. But now they're like, okay, we tested whether changes in experimentally derived correlations between DFLPC and the insula predicted between DLPFC and the amygdala, between DLPFC and the NACC, and DLPC and the insula predicted greater redistribution. So when the DLPFC focused on the amygdala, did we get greater distribution? When the DLPFC was clearly leading to control of the NACC, did we get more redistribution? Or the insula, did we get more distribution? Only the NACC demonstrating that this connectivity, this correlation, and I want you to realize what this connectivity means. This is the you part of your brain controlling the reward part of your brain, okay? Compassion trainees who showed greater DLPFC NACC connectivity
redistributed more funds? That's important. In the group that redistributed more funds, can we predict who distributed the most funds? Yes, we can. Those whose DLPFC directly was related to the NACC, okay? So those whose executive resources, those conscious working memory processes, that self was leading to changes in the NACC were the ones in the compassion group who redistributed the most. Those are the ones that were the most focused on fairness, that were the most likely to donate behavior. No relationship was found for the other areas. Then they get to the arousal correlations. Arousal correlations with altruistic redistribution and neural change. Compassion training may increase altruistic behavior by decreasing personal distress evoked by suffering. We found that decreases in reported arousal to images of suffering were correlated with increased redistribution in compassion training. So those who experienced the most arousal to the pictures in compassion training were more likely to redistribute, but not reappraisal trainees. Oh, I'm sorry. I read that wrong. We found that decreases in reported arousal to images of suffering were correlated with increased redistribution in compassion trainees. Compassion trainees over the course of 2 weeks were able to reduce their arousal to very sad and difficult pictures of people suffering. 2 weeks. That's all it takes. I'm going to take a break because I'm kind of tired of the numbers right now and talk about what this means about our society, right? What this means about our structures. We need this cooperation bit, as we read last time, to thrive, to be the most successful species on the planet. However, this isn't our primary goal. We are very self-focused. And what we can do is we can engage in a cultural practice developed in Eastern traditions and Eastern religions, right? Particularly Japan, China, India, these meditation contemplative practices that are all the rage now in Western culture. We can do that in the course of 2 weeks, and we can reduce our experience of arousal and negative affect. So you need to step back and see the utility of just that in your life. If you experience a lot of emotion, engaging in compassion-based meditation training can really, really impact and reduce your stress that you experience on an everyday level. So if you experience a level of anxiety or a level of frustration or stress that you don't enjoy, maybe it's test anxiety, maybe it's relationship anxiety, maybe it's like stress due to all these, maybe it's stress due to living in the capitalist system, right? Or maybe it's stress due to the pandemic. You need to engage in meditation practices because what happens there is a complex alteration in your mind where the areas that are associated with executive functioning, the you, right, is leading to different activities in different areas of the brain. Particularly under compassion training, it's leading to a connection between the NACC, which I can't wait to read the discussion about, and actual behavior. So it's that connection, that connection between DLPFC and NACC that leads to the IPC behavior, which leads to the behavior, right? It's not the executive function by itself. It's not the IPC by itself. It's the executive functioning affecting the NACC, affecting the IPC, right? But ultimately, what that means is that meditation practices derived from long-standing cultural practices can change your brain in 2 weeks and also your behavior in 2 weeks. So I think that's really important. The piece for our class that's missing that you're probably like, why the hell are we reading this? The cultural piece, this religion piece, this prayer practice, meditation practice piece, analogy to prayer practice, right? These behaviors that we consistently engage in as part of a spiritual practice alter our brains and might even lead to the feeling of spirituality. Okay, let's get to their discussion. Oh, and I guess I missed the figures, but these are just
Um, huh. I guess I missed the reference to those figures, but we can look at those, right? And what you see here is you see these activation areas. This is where the IPC is. This is the area of the brain that's leading to the final behavior. This is the area of the brain, the area of self that some would say, that's causing this area to be altered through the NACC, which they don't show. They these graphs are kind of complicated, but like it's all described down here. Activation in the right IPC and right dorsolateral PFC. The brain images in A and C show blood oxygen level dependent changes in right IPC and right DLPFC respectively from before to after training in compassion trainees. So remember, like, there's a lot of data here. You know, my friends kind of have a lot of data going on here. But before compassion and after compassion, you see changes in these two areas. These two areas changed. Let's keep reading that graph description, because once we're through this, then we're into the discussion. In both sessions, participants regulated their emotional responses while viewing images of human suffering. Images are in MNI space. The color coding indicates the amount of variance accounted for by the group by redistribution rank interaction. The blue outline in C, what's that indicate? Indicates that the cluster was identified by a conjunction test. That's relation to the IPC. So this happened before this. Blue leads to red, I guess. The scatter plots with best fitting regression lines in B and D show ranked transformed redistribution amounts for the two training groups as a function of the percentage signal change in bold responses from before training to after training. Now these are the correlations that are examining redistribution. So you see a correlation here might be driven by a couple outliers. They're saying they got rid of their outliers. They had more outliers. But if you look at this piece right here and removed it, right, remove this piece, I think the correlation would drop quite substantially in the compassion training group. Maybe even substantially enough for it not to be significant. And I think it's important, like if that's just one observation, look at that. It's an outlier in both graphs. And this effect may go away. But that's all I'm noticing right there. But ultimately, you get in the DLPFC, in folks in the compassion training only, in those in the non-compassion training, it almost looks like there's a negative relationship there. So let's break this down. In compassion training, the greater the percentage bold before training and after training of the DLPFC, which is the areas of self engaged in emotionally difficult situations. So those folks, those changes in that DLPFC signal actually were highly correlated with redistribution, their rank in the data. So that's just an important note there. So folks who had the strongest DLPFC changes before and after training were those who donated more. The same thing is true for only the folks in the compassion group who, the red dots, those who showed the greatest change in IPC activity were the ones who were the most likely to redistribute towards the equal distribution. And you can see that there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 distributed in a way that made it equal for their partners. Now, if we look at the reappraisal training, we actually see negative effects for the most part in these two regions. You see this for the DLPFC specifically. So you got more activity in the DLPFC, but that led to less activity. Well, that led to less redistribution. And the reasons for that, we got to really engage with this question. Why would that happen? Well, when you are reappraising your emotion, you're focused on yourself. You're not focused on others, right? So your focus isn't on the pain of someone else. It's on your own, managing your own emotions. So when you're doing that, you're being a jerk. You're not going to help people out. And so other than doing meditation, I want you to consider how you process other people's lives. When you see somebody else in pain, are you trying to downregulate your own emotions, or are you trying to regulate your emotions by engaging in compassion with them? That is not necessarily complete, overwhelming negative affect. So do you just try to remove the negative affect from your life? Or do you try to engage in compassion with others, and instead of trying to remove negative affect from your life, trying to increase positive affect in your life by doing something nice for someone else? You see a similar negative correlation in the IPC. And all this tells us is that the two training conditions led to different types of behaviors. So those negative lines, those negative correlations for the reappraisal training don't ruin this study. All they tell us is that, well, they wouldn't ruin the study anyways, but they don't tell us anything super important either. They just tell us that, okay, like these folks, these brain areas aren't associated with redistribution activity for these folks, even though there were changes in these areas for folks in these conditions. Okay. So there's their results. That's what's going on. If it doesn't make sense, let's just look at it one more time. For those individuals in the compassion training, the pre-post change in DLPFC predicted change in redistribution. Those with the highest change in DLPFC pre and post training were those that were engaging fairly. And you had even some people engaging unfairly or engaging hyper fairly, where they're hurting themselves versus others in both groups. The same relationship can be found pre-post training in the IPC, where those changes predicted behavioral changes. In terms of the correlations within the groups, those are 0.49 correlations. Essentially, I'm guessing those two brain areas are very highly correlated in these folks and in these behaviors, but these changes are a correlation of 0.49. To understand a correlation, you square it. And what you get when you square it is you get 0.25 essentially. And what you learn is that 25% of the variation in redistribution rank was driven by variation in the bold response in these areas, both of them specifically. Okay? So these changes in brain activity led to a quarter of the changes in behavior, also leaving open 75% of changes in behavior due to other things like individual differences, maybe interpretation of the instructions and things like that. All right, so I'm going back to the discussion. Individuals who trained in compassion for 2 weeks were more altruistic toward a victim after witnessing an unfair social interaction compared with individuals who trained in reappraisal and individuals in a validation control group. This demonstrates that a purely mental training can generalize to behavioral domains by affecting social behavior outside of the training context. We've seen that before in social psych. Furthermore, increases in altruistic responses were correlated with training-related changes in neural responses to suffering. That's pretty cool, which provides evidence for functional neuroplasticity in the circuitry underlying compassion and altruism. All that means is that this circuitry can change, and it makes sense that this circuitry can change. We don't want to show everyone the same altruistic, compassionate response, right? We want to show, like in terms of survival, we want to show it to people who we can trust, who we work with, who we engage with, right? But we also want to be able to turn it off to people that are violating these rules. And I think that's very interesting. The pattern of neural changes in compassion training suggests that increased altruistic behavior is achieved by enhancing neural mechanisms that support the understanding of other states. So that's getting into sort of the NACC. And so that's one. Greater frontoparietal executive control, greater self taking over one's behavior, and upregulation of positive emotional systems. So, and the increase of positive emotion, essentially, the DLPFC leading to an increase in the NACC, which is a positive emotional system, I guess. I haven't seen that in the article yet, so I'm trying right now. I'm like, where's that coming from? Because I've been following this closely. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I know there's going to be stuff I miss. Greater IPC activation specifically predicted greater redistribution in compassion trainees and not in reappraisal trainees, which suggests that IPC recruitment is a unique neural marker for altruism induced by compassion training. So compassion training impacts IPC, IPC affects behavior. This region has been this is what I wanted to see. This region has been implicated in the human mirror neuron system and may reflect increased simulation of the suffering of other people if the signal of other people's suffering is indeed increased by compassion training. This leads to an emotion regulatory challenge that requires trainees to approach rather than avoid suffering in order to engage in pro-social behavior. So, if the signal of other people's suffering is indeed increased by compassion training, which is what we're seeing here, this leads to an emotion regulatory challenge. The challenge is that trainees approach rather than avoid suffering. They're arguing that our natural inclination is to avoid suffering. This transformation of emotional responses may have been instantiated in the self network, right? The frontoparietal executive control network, the U network, in order to increase altruistic behavior in compassion trainees. The coordinated activation of the IPC and DLPFC in compassion trainees may reflect greater sustained attention and goal maintenance. So what they're saying here is that DLPFC to IPFC, the stronger that correlation we were talking about earlier, that suggests those people are more effective at maintaining their goal and obtaining it. And the goal in this case is compassion, but the neurological goal is to increase that activity in the IPC so that we can help more, essentially. You're trying to make that an automatic neurological response. So when you practice something, it gets better, right? Well, in this case, we're practicing compassion, and that leads the IPC to become a better responder that leads to more help. To help others, as well as integration of information from systems that process both external information and internal information. Let's go to this. Let's go to this graph here. Let's see what this one's all about. This is about the connection between the DLPFC and the NACC right here. So we see that compassion training led to a positive correlation between these areas. And it isn't the strongest correlation in this graph. So what we got here is compassion training led this to lead activation here to lead to more activation here. And this is the NACC, right? And this is the area that's focused on the sense of others, experiencing others' emotional pain, essentially. So when you're engaged in compassion training, you lead to a positive correlation between the areas of self and the areas of experiencing other people's distress. But what's interesting is that in the reappraisal training, you get an even stronger, almost double the effect, right? Where the training is such that it leads to, like, there is a correlation between DLPFC and NACC. However, it's negative, suggesting that those in the reappraisal condition are using their executive resources, their sense of self, right here, to reduce activity in that area that's associated with my experiencing your pain. So one approach to other people suffering is to actually encourage brain areas that allow you to feel and understand their pain. That leads to helping versus just completely trying to reduce that pain and escape the situation. So I think that's really cool. Regulation of internal information may include increasing positive emotions towards other people suffering. So they're arguing that why would anybody want to experience more suffering or understand this, or why would they want to show this activity? So it may happen that like what we're doing is we're kind of framing this suffering, we're re-experiencing it in positive ways. And I'm like, wait, how can you do that? That seems sadistic, right? Well, no, like the idea of helping someone else out is very rewarding. I think this is why you see a lot of like white savior stuff in Latin America, right? Because people really want to feel like they're making a difference, even though, as we read in the first couple of articles for this class, that they very well may be harming other people. And so like one of the things to realize is that sometimes something that seems negative or is negative in one situation can actually be positive in another. So, giving gifts on Christmas, right? I lost money, but it feels a lot better than having money in my bank account, right? This may represent increased positive appraisals of aversive stimuli by enhancing the reward value of the victim's well-being. So look at that. If you can reframe a situation to this person's suffering to I'm going to increase their well-being, boom, you can live a better life. I'm not sure if I often get a few nursing and pre-health folks, keep this line in mind while you are going into your career, right? Like if you can focus on the well-being of others and improving that, you're going to be better off and focused on the suffering of others. So I think that's interesting because compassion training does do that. It like asks you to have compassion for somebody else, to like really understand where they're coming from, to not judge them. I could see that. Furthermore, decreased reported arousal after compassion training may be due to enhancement of reward-related neural systems. So less arousal may be due to experiencing more positive affect in the brain. These findings also support research suggesting that compassion training enhances positive emotions and neural substrates of affiliation. The relationship between training-induced neural changes and altruistic behavior was not unique to compassion trainees. In fact, greater changes in these regions predicted less redistribution in reappraisal trainees. This finding may be due to the differing regulatory goals between compassion training and reappraisal training. In compassion training, and I was saying this earlier, the goal was to increase caring for people who are suffering and to help, whereas the goal in reappraisal training was to decrease personal negative emotions. In a social context, the goals of compassion training and reappraisal training are opposing, and this may explain the crossover interaction effects. In reappraisal training, neural changes may have resulted in decreased helping of other individuals in order to serve the primary goal of decreasing personal negative affect. A clear limitation of the study is that altruistic behavior was not measured at pre-training, although a separate validation sample was used to estimate pre-training levels. Future research may build on this study's finding by measuring altruism at baseline, which may strengthen claims that compassion training increases altruism. Furthermore, emotional valence and arousal may be measured using methodology that is less susceptible to demand characteristics, such as facial electromyography, so that's like measuring face muscles, and skin conductance responses. In future research, longitudinal designs should be employed to determine the length of compassion training needed to have sustained behavioral effects. In sum, these results build on existing evidence that the adult human brain may demonstrate functional and structural changes after mental training. Duh. I don't know why that's so surprising. And extend these previous findings to include socio-emotional domains such as compassion and altruism. Our findings support the possibility that compassion and altruism can be viewed as trainable skills rather than a stable trait. This lays the groundwork for future research to explore whether compassion-related trainings can benefit fields that depend on altruism and cooperation, medicine, as well as clinical subgroups of medicine. Is characterized by deficits in compassion. As well as clinical subgroups characterized as deficits in compassion, such as psychopaths. All right. So there's a lot there. I know you got lost in the weeds, but essentially, here's the takeaway, right? Training, right? Compassion training leads to an increase in fairness redistribution, actually paying one's own money to help somebody else out after they've been treated poorly. This relationship is likely driven by the IPC activation. That's what's driving people to redistribute. But in between is the fact that the DLPFC, which is your sense of self, leads to an increase in the NACC, which is your sort of experience of someone else's situation, which then likely is, there's some things in the middle, but that likely is, well, it was with their analysis, but that is correlated with the changes in the IPC. And so now we see a full picture there. This whole paper was about showing the brain networks that are associated with increases in behavioral compassion. Now, why was I interested in this as a cultural psychologist? That story is not as clear. But essentially, this is a cultural practice that many folks engage in, that folks engage in differentially across our different ethnicities and cultures, you know. And if we look at the major distinction that cultural psychology has shown, it's the individualistic versus collectivistic differences. And if you look at sort of where the training came from, people in Asia, one of the strongest collectivistic cultural regions, or the strongest cultural region in all of the world according to our science, right, is also the region where folks engage in meditation and compassion-based meditation and these practices that seem like, oh, this is just about me reducing my own negative affect, but really it's a cultural tool that binds us together. So what I like about this is it shows you the biological mechanism of self and culture. So like culture comes in, tells you to do something, you do it. DLPFC is activated. That DLPFC activated is doing the thing you're being asked to do. That consistent behavior trains your brain to automatically respond. This is the neural mechanism of culture. Enjoy.